Welcome back to the Nampa Public Library's US-250 podcast, where we will be digging into the history of how we became a nation.
I'm Marcus.
And I'm Amanda. Here's our 30,000-foot view of the beginnings of the French and Indian War. We're not talking about the tensions yet. Today, we'll be covering the basics, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty in upcoming episodes.
So, here is the main players on the French side. The French Empire under King Louis XV, the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Abenaki tribe, the Algonquins, the Ottawa, and other tribes.
And the main British players were Great Britain Empire under King George II, the American colonists, the Cherokee, the Iroquois Confederacy, and others.
In spite of the war's moniker, the French and Indian War, not all Native Americans sided with the French. While the majority of Native American tribes backed the French, numerous tribes remained neutral, fought alongside the British, or shifted allegiances with the winds of war. Native American tribes, which laid claim to the same territories that the British and French were fighting over, were hardly monolithic, and their fault lines were reflected in the sides that they backed. Here are some notable names you may have heard relating to the French and Indian War. On Britain's side, we have Edward Braddock, James Wolfe, and Geoffrey Amherst.
On the French side, the main players were Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, François-Marie de Lignery, and Daniel Lénard de Beaujeu. Notable American colonists who fought on the British side were George Washington and Daniel Boone. Interestingly enough, Daniel Boone was a supply wagon driver during the French and Indian War.
The French and Indian War began after a series of incidents on the upper Ohio River Valley, which the French and the British governments both claimed as their territory. Military forces assembled by both imperial powers built forts in the region and attempted to capture each other's forts, like a very intense game of capture the flag. Wanting to limit British influence along their frontier, the French built a string of forts from Lake Erie towards the forks of the Ohio, present-day Pittsburgh.
According to History.com, George Washington, a 21-year-old with no combat training, was dispatched by Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie to southwestern Pennsylvania with a written order to French forces to vacate the contested territory of the Ohio Valley. When the French refused, Lieutenant Colonel Washington returned the following year with a force of hundreds and ambushed a small scouting party before dawn on May 28, 1754. The first military action of Washington's life resulted in the death of 13 enemy soldiers and launched the French and Indian War. The shots fired in Pennsylvania would become the first in the world's first global war.
An interesting fact we found was that Native American tribes taught the French how to fight while hiding and using camouflage during this war. Prior to this, the British had always fought it out in the open, lined up, and advancing toward the foe while firing. This previously unknown type of warfare caught the British off guard and led to a number of British deaths.
One documentary recommendation we have for you is The Great Courses, Native People of North America. This documentary talks about the history of Native Americans in North America, as well as those involved in the French and Indian War and the Revolution. You can check this out by going to nampalibrary.org/catalog. You can also find it on Canopy by going to nampalibrary.org/canopy and creating an account. This is a free streaming service provided to Nampa patrons through the Nampa Library. Check out the link in the description to see the videos listed.
Some book recommendations are Who Was Daniel Boone by Sydelle Kramer, The Matchlock Gun by Walter D. Edmonds, and The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Thank you for tuning in to this month's US-250 episode. We'll see you next month.
Bye.